What is actually to have functions within a function? In Cataronics, that's the idea that all of the functions manifest all the four cognitive functions inside themselves. So it becomes this inception in which all the functions always have all of the other functions within it. In the balance video, we actually explored this inceptional balance, which is to have a balance between the functions within a function. Okay, so here's an example. The brain as a physical organ is actually, in Cataronics, a T function. So here we have the thinking brain, which is sort of a thinking function, and it has feeling functions inside of it. So you have components in our brain that is related to the experience of feeling and emotion. Names for these organs is typically like the limbic brain, amygdala, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, pineal gland maybe, and the brainstem. Maybe, at least I get orgasm feelings in my brainstem, so I assume that the brainstem also is emotional in a way. Kundalini stuff, and when I listen to music, when I'm really cringe, I get this orgasm in my brainstem. On the other side, we have the heart organ, which is actually a feeling type of organ in Cataronics. This organ also have other functions inside it. For example, the thinking function. The heart actually has its own neurons, its own brain, its own nervous system, or it has its own thinking system. This thinking system is called intrinsic ganglia and can be found in HeartMath Institute, for example. Here is a view of the rat heart, where they were able to locate exactly where this brain is located. So that's the yellow dots in this image. That's the brain or thinking inside the feeling heart of a rat. And maybe you wonder, like, why do we talk about the heart as a feeling function? Well, that's because I had an experience in which I felt love in my heart and very personal feelings in my heart, in my chest. And that's why I know that that's probably the center of emotion. So the inside brain is more like sub-centers of emotion, while the heart is the real center of emotion in our human body. And when I say personal in this theory, I actually don't refer to the individual. When I say personal, it actually refers to feeling, to who we are as consciousness and as a feeling of self, essentially. And that feeling of self is love, which can be experienced both individually and collectively. And also, as we can see in this image right here, the electromagnetic field of the heart, which is what I had in my experience. I had emotions outside me and in my chest, in my heart, and both the emotion inside my heart and the emotion outside me in a bubble were very personal and loving and felt like my soul, essentially. And this field is measured scientifically as well by something called magnetocardiography. Emotion does actually not need to be felt through the nervous system. It can actually be felt outside the nervous system in some other faculty that we have. Maybe some sort of astral body, for example. It's important to realize that this emotion I had was felt outside of me. So it was not that it came into me. I felt it directly outside of me. And therefore, Cataronics believe that both emotions and thoughts doesn't actually need to be felt or thought inside our bodily structure. Which means that feeling and thinking within our bodily structure can be considered sub-functions of sensing. And when we feel or think outside our body, that can be considered more of a intuitive sort of feeling or thinking. And I don't know if that's actually physical thinking and feeling, but at least it's more metaphysical than what we have in our body. In astral dreams, one can have very emotional experiences, and these emotions may be not produced by the body, but more so picked up by the body. Intuition inside sensing. You write the intuition letter in a box and sensing behind it. So it means a function intuition within the sensing domain. And that means it's essentially a sensing function, and more so than it is an intuitive function. And also this model is a weighting scale, but maybe it's not the best model to represent this because it's not about balance, it's just only about polarity, so keep that in mind. Pretend it has 4 scales or 4 arms, because there's 4 functions within a function. Okay, so here we have another example, which is that when we talk about value systems in normal MBTI and stuff, in Cataronics, a value system is actually not a feeling function, because a value system implies that it is a system, and a system in Cataronics is a thinking thing. So it's a thinking domain thing to make systems. Feeling within thinking becomes a value system. And yes, this is relative and infinite. This goes forever and forever, both like in the macrocosm and also in the microcosm. Alright, so this is sort of a sneak peek, so we're gonna skip it a little bit, but the point about this model is that it shows us how this model can be used to understand the transition between polarities. For example, when we talk about normal typology, we usually say that intuition is pattern recognition or predicting the future or something like that, but it's actually not that, because all about the past and the timeline in a sense, like, and the space-time is actually sensing. So when an intuitive person is doing pattern recognition or something like predicting the future, for example, it's actually intuition within sensing. This model in particular will have its own video, so you can check out that video in the description below. But yeah, the essential thing about this model is essentially that other typology is basically, they have this idea that all of the typology exists inside a human physical brain. And what that does is actually that it's a very like sub function of all of the 4 functions. So actually it explores the 4 functions or 8 functions in essentially in a very distorted dimension of the actuality, if that makes sense. What Cataronics is actually attempting to do is more so to find the root of all of these functions instead of defining sub-functions within a function, because that doesn't necessarily give us the best idea about what these functions are actually about. So for example, other typology theories is essentially intuition, feeling, thinking, and sensing within the sensing function. So it's basically sub-sensing functions. So for example, a biologist could actually extend this personality theory into biology rather than personality, and they can make other sensing kind of ideas about these functions. For example, they can say that the sensing is how the cell rebirth themselves and stays on task, for example. And then they can say that the T function in the cell is that it systematically know when to change behavior. They can see the F function in a cell, like how it responds to feeling chemicals. And then they can maybe say that the intuition function is when the cell is duplicating, or maybe more so when it's mutating and adapting to some sort of environment based on a predictable sense of natural selection. All of those ideas are sub-sensing functions. And yes, even typologies are very sensing-like because they explain, basically, it's the personality ego, right? And the ego, actually, at least according to Cataronics, the ego is actually purely sensing. So it makes sense then that the personalities within this sub-sensing realm is about the ego. It's actually true, it's about the ego. But the functions feeling, thinking, and intuition is actually, they're not coming from the sensing domain. So they also exist entirely outside of the ego. And when I'm saying in here, that's my individual ego, which Cataronics call SI. But the collective ego is actually not only me, but it's everyone, and even space-time itself, actually. So everything we see in our physical reality is essentially a part of our ego, or collective ego. So what does that mean? It means that all of the functions in regular topology is essentially the habitual orientation towards existential phenomena. So what that actually means is that an intuition hero is actually still a sensing dominant in a way, but they have habitual orientation in their ego that disassociate them with the ego. So it's like a ritual. So a ritual is intuitive within sensing because it's a habitual sensing structure that reminds the person of liberating themselves from the habit and the ego. It's a reminder that they should step outside of the known, outside of the ego. And how do you step outside of the ego? Well, this is essentially like meditation. You disidentify with the ego structure, and they found the use in doing that because it's useful. It's not a bad thing to do. And that's why they are intuitive heroes, but they are still actually contained in their sensing. Except of course, when they are in the ritual, they actually do connect with the other side. So it's not impossible to be something else than sensing, but usually as humans, we are almost always in our sensing. And we are actually much more inside sensing than we think we are. And essentially disassociating with your firm identity, you can be more free with your identity. And that actually leads me into sensing within intuition. Because when you have sensing contained within intuition, that means essentially that you are in the spirit realm, but you are going partially into the sensing realm in order to rehabituate yourself. And that's why the intuitive people often can change their life through their intuition. Essentially, they leave their identity and look at their identity and then change their identity by looking at what's actually going on. And then they go back into their identity with a new sense of self, new version of their ego. Even though typology is very sensing dominant, it's also maybe even more so thinking dominant, which is socionics is a very good example for a very thinking dominant typology, and really all typologies really. But what happens is that they explore the functions, all the four functions, with logic. It thinks it's a product of logos alone. It thinks that logos is properly defining all the functions, which is actually not true. Logos can only define logos, really, and it can give good ideas about what the other three functions is about, but logos can only define logos. And that's why, in order to define feeling, you have to use feeling. In order to define intuition, you have to use intuition. And in order to define sensing, you have to define it through sensing. This is how it actually works. And for example, if we do a counter version of this thinking way to define typology, you can do the same with the feeling function, which is essentially like exploring these functions more in a personal way through the feeling function, essentially like embodying these different characters as your personal essence in order to grasp what it is like to be those functions. So that's the functions within the feeling function. It will typically look more artistic and more self-expressive. Actually, a very good example of this, typology art, which is to draw like a relationship pair, for example. That's sort of a feeling expression of what that means. Subfunctions is coming into the picture. It's a little bit complex, but that's also how reality is, really. I hope that kind of still made some sort of clarity for you, and maybe at least an interesting perspective to explore. And yeah, I really think that like when we explore these functions like under the transcendent core definition of the functions rather than pretending they are in our physical brain, will essentially give us a better tool for how things really work and how we can live our lives, even though we are humans and we have a brain. So of course that sub-function will still be very useful for us humans, but we also live in essentially divinity. And if we want to know more about divinity, we can't really study our physical thinking brain and think that we will arrive at some kind of answer, because that's in the sub-function of sensing. And then we only reach sensing. To know more about the fundamentals rather than the sub-functions and stuff, check out the video on that, which will be linked in the description below. Relevant for the sub-function stuff we have been talking about here is the video about how we can manifest better by understanding the sub-functions of intuition. Check out that video below, and I hope I can see you there.